improve its long-term prospects. The war in Ukraine has created another opening for India to join the stronger side, but it has also revived the dilemma about accessing the riches of markets and technology at the cost of ceding policy sovereignty. As you say, the offer would not remain open for long, and India must make up its mind about the bargain quickly. Still, the pros and cons of the choice needs to be worked out, and who better than someone with your experience and knowledge to explain India's situation, position, and prospects. Ladies and gentlemen, today we will also have the pleasure of unveiling Ambassador Saran's new book, How China Sees India and the World for the AIMA Fraternity. It's an outstanding sequel to his previous book, How India Sees the World. Catalia, the 21st Century, which was published exactly 2 years ago. In his new book, he has explained China's attitude and policy towards India through the lens of history. Ambassador Saran, you have been India's top diplomat and you have served as India's ambassador in some key countries in Asia. You have also been the chairman of the National Security Advisory Board and the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change. You were awarded the Padma Bhushan in 2011 for your contribution to the civil service. It's an honor to have you with us today, and a very warm welcome to you in AIMA's 57th Leaders Speak session, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, India is feeling the heat of global spotlight because it has been reluctant to condemn Russia and join the Western economic war against it. India has long-standing military and diplomatic ties with Russia, but India's economic prospects are tied to the US. The US sees India as the key to isolating Russia and to marginalize the emerging China-Russia axis. India is feeling Chinese expansion and it has moved closer to the US, which sees India as the linchpin of its China containment efforts. However, the pressure to abandon Russia has made things tricky for India. We look at India's option with Ambassador Saran. Ambassador Saran's new book about China is great education. It is part history, part polemic, and explains how the two trans-Himalayan neighbors with historic ties have got to the point of inexorable conflict. It is full of fascinating nuggets of history that are shaping the contemporary politics and diplomacy in South Asia and beyond. Ambassador Saran has been a participant in the volatile relationship between the two aspiring superpowers, and we could not have a better person to educate us about how the Chinese see India and how India can find peace with its bigger, richer, and stronger neighbor. It is now my pleasure to invite Ambassador Saran to deliver his talk on India's choice between neutrality and alignment, and also about his new book of China. So, shall we release the book first? Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. So, may I begin? Thank you very much for inviting me to this session. Thank you, Mr. Ranganathan, Chairman, for your very kind words and generous introduction. And I would also like to thank Rekha with whom I have a very long association, for inviting me to this session. Also very happy to see some familiar faces around the table, particularly my very old friend Rajiv, who is here, and also some other colleagues. So today I have been asked to speak on India's neutrality and whether we should be staying the course, that is, should we be staying neutral or should we make a switch, that is,
take a decision to join one or the other side. Of course, like most issues in diplomacy, it is very difficult to give a either or kind of answer or a yes and no answer. Most issues that we confront as diplomats do not permit us to make those kind of choices. So there are always shades of gray between black and white, which we have to navigate. So that is the reality on the ground. But I just wanted to, before I get into the subject, I wanted to at least point out to you that the word neutral is a very specific term in international relations and diplomacy. And it is described as the status of a country that refrains from participation in a war between other states, and it maintains impartial attitude towards the belligerents. That is the more precise definition of what neutrality means. And also, the more important thing is that in order to be regarded as neutral, the belligerents must recognize you as neutral. Otherwise, merely by declaring that you're neutral, it doesn't really help you very much. And also, I would like to, particularly to an Indian audience, also try to make clear to you that neutrality is not something which has been associated with India's name historically, which is non-alignment. For a number of years, India was supposed to be the champion of non-alignment. And I was also rather intrigued to hear recently somebody like Amit Shah, the Home Minister of India, also saying, no, India is not taking sides, it is non-aligned. So whatever may be the difference of opinion with the previous governments on foreign policy issues, it appears that even the current government considers non-alignment a useful kind of a position to take. So non-alignment, at least as far as Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru described it, was not that you should be sitting on the fence all the time. His view was that we should be taking decisions on various foreign policy issues, on the merits of those issues. But even that he qualified by saying, but taking into account what are India's enlightened self-interest. That is how he described it. And in the specific context of the post-Second World War international situation, it was that India and other non-aligned countries will not align themselves either with the Eastern Bloc, which is led by the Soviet Union, or the Western Bloc led by the United States. It was, in a sense, a rejection of the ideological and military confrontation which came to exist after the Second World War. And that is how India became a non-aligned country, to retain a fairly, shall I say, as much strategic autonomy, people say, as was possible. Strategic autonomy is described as the ability of a state, particularly a major country like India, to be able to take relatively autonomous decisions on issues which are of priority to that country. So not that India should be able to take relatively autonomous decision on all issues, but rather to be able to take those kind of independent decisions on issues which are of great importance to India. And secondly, you would also note that the word relative is used here, which means that no state when you have a world which is populated by many independent and sovereign states, no state can be fully, autonomous in the sense that it can take absolute decisions on issues of interest to it. It always has to reconcile its own interests with the interests of other states as well. That is why it is always relative. So in that sense, if we now look at the current situation, where you have Russia, which has invaded a sovereign independent state like Ukraine, in terms of India's own consistent position on international issues, or its adherence, for example, to the UN Charter, we cannot but disagree with what the US, what Soviet Russia has done with respect to Ukraine. I mean, even if we don't say it, the fact is that Russia has invaded another independent sovereign state, and that is something which is difficult for India to endorse, much less, approve. Which is the reason why, if you go back just a few years, in 2014, when Russia also invaded Crimea, which is a part of Ukraine, and declared that it was now part of Russia, we did not, like currently, we did not openly criticize Russia, but we refused to endorse that. We did not, despite the fact that Russia was very keen that India should at least express understanding of what Russia was doing, we were unable to do so. In that sense, India's view is very clear that this action which Russia has taken in Ukraine is not action which India can support in terms of its own principles. So this should be remembered when we are talking about, why has India taken a position supportive of Russia? That is not quite true. India has not taken a position which is supportive of Russia. Now, if you look at when the issue has come up in the United Nations, in the Security Council, and later in the General Assembly, it is true that the condemnation of Russia, resolutions which were condemning Russia, we did not support those resolutions. We abstained on them. We did not vote against. There were some countries which voted against them in support of Russia. But we joined several other countries who abstained on this, which is the reason why some people think that we have taken a kind of a neutral position, because we abstained. But if you look at the statements made by the Indian representative to the UN in explaining India's vote, you will see very clearly that on balance, actually, India has adopted a fairly critical attitude, maintaining, for example, that it can never be justified that a country which is independent sovereign should be invaded by another country. Also expressing concern about the human rights violations which have been taking place in Ukraine. And in that context, there was a place called Busha where there was some massacres which had taken place of Ukrainians. And I think there India came fairly close to actually criticizing Russia directly for that violence. So India has been, yes, taking a somewhat nuanced position with regard to Russian action in Ukraine. But it has not been supportive of Russia. I mean, that point is quite clear that India is not supporting Russia. Reference has been made to sanctions, and whether India has, by not joining the Western sanctions against Russia, has in fact thereby demonstrated its support for Russia. That's in Russia. Then here also there is a certain history. For quite some time, India has made it very clear that while it would be obliged to observe sanctions which are mandated by the United Nations, it will not observe sanctions which have been put on any state bilaterally. This applies to Iran. This applies to other countries which are subject to US sanctions. There are a large number of countries, as you know, which are subject to some sanction or the other by the United States. In those cases, we have made it clear that we are only obliged to administer sanctions which have been through resolutions passed by the United Nations itself. We will not observe bilateral sanctions. So in that context, the position taken by India with regard to sanctions against Russia is also consistent with what is the position taken for considerable length of time. Also, it has been stated that we can see that India is perhaps not on the same page with the Western countries, particularly the United States, when it comes to, for example, buying oil from Russia. And here I think one should perhaps be a little careful not to take such criticism, at face value, because if you see, even till today, the largest purchasers of Russian oil and gas are actually Western countries, Western European countries. So it is a bit odd that while they are still doing that kind of business, hundreds of billions of dollars are still flowing to the coffers of Russia as a result of these sales, that they should be raising objection about, rather minor sales of oil to India. It is true that India is taking advantage of the situation of oil being offered at discount, but, it is not something that exposes India to actually violating any kind of international norms. And as I said, those who are shouting the loudest are the ones who are also privately doing their own deals with Russia. So one should keep in mind that this is a more complicated situation than perhaps in either or kind of situation, that is India neutral or is India not neutral? Is it supporting Russia or is not supporting Russia? Now, those who say we should be more explicit in our support of Russia do give some arguments. They say, for example, that Russia for quite some time has been a very reliable friend of India, a very reliable partner of India. If you take the period from 1960 to say 1990, before the collapse of the then Soviet Union, it is fair to say that this was a period of a very strong strategic partnership between India and Russia. So meeting the challenge which we face, for example, from Pakistan, meeting the challenge which we face from China, certainly Russia was a very, very important partner in terms of giving us, defense hardware, technology, also helping India during that particular period with the rupee-ruble payment agreement, because a large part of our trade, which we could not have for reasons of competitiveness, could not find a market in the West, did find a market in Russia, and vice versa. So there were good reasons why there was a very strong and very positive, empathetic relationship between India and the Soviet Union. But what I would like to make clear here is that Indo-Soviet relations is not India-Russia relations. These are two very different kinds of relations. Why? Because when Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, the change which took place in geopolitics is something that many people perhaps do not appreciate. Until then, it was China which was the main adversary of Russia, of the Soviet Union. And the reason why India and Soviet Union had a strategic partnership was precisely because of the perception of a common threat from China to both India and the Soviet Union. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, that particular element then almost completely evaporated. So China was no longer seen by Russia as a threat, and Russia did not look upon China as a threat. In fact, over a period of time, their relations became more and more positive. So the one thing which really brought India and the Soviet Union together in terms of a strategic partnership, that was no longer there after 1990. And that's a very important change which took place. Also, if you see on the economic side, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the whole logic behind, say, the rupee-ruble trade, that also went out of the window. So both Russia as well as India then went for normal, MFN trade. And we had to, of course, a big price to pay, if you remember, because we had to pay back the ruble debt at the old rate rather than at the new market rate. But anyway, after having put that aside, trade between India and Russia, as you will see, consistently was on the decline and has continued to decline. So there is not much commercial relationship between India and Russia today. A few $1 billion, that's about it. Even if you take the energy trade of Russian oil and gas, is India a large purchaser of Russian oil and gas? No. The biggest purchaser is Europe, and secondly, China. India is very far behind. We have a much stronger energy relationship with, for example, the Gulf countries. The other important component which people talk about is the defense relationship. And there it is true that after 1990, even though India began to diversify its defense hardware relationship with various countries, in particular with the United States of America, because a large part of our assets, defense assets, were of Russian origin, the need for spares components has continued. So today, about 38 to 39% of new hardware still comes from Russia, but nearly 68 to 69% of spares and components that the Indian armed forces need still have to come from Russia. So that legacy relationship still continues to be very important. But as far as the overall defense relationship is concerned, that has also been declining over a period of time. So starting from, say, 1990s, when the defense hardware relationship with the US was virtually zero. Today, it's something like $20 billion. And it is growing, while the dependence on Russia is actually declining. There are some areas where the relationship with Russia continues to be very important. So there are some very high technology areas where we still do not have access to similar technology from the West. For example, nuclear submarines. For example, what we have bought, the SS-400 missile system. These are still not available to us from the West. So these we still are purchasing from Russia. But if you look at overall, this relationship has also been declining. So this is why I'm saying that when we are talking about why Russia is still very important, yes, there are some areas where there is importance of this relationship, but one strategic partnership that was there with reference to China is no longer there. With regard to trade, very minimal. And with respect to defense, India is diversifying and will continue to diversify. And what this war has done is that even that legacy relationship that we have with Russia, with respect to lot of spares and components, now we are facing difficulties because of the disruptions caused by the war. Russia itself needs a lot of those spares and components. US and other so they are not able to keep up the same supply to India as in the past. There are disruptions. Secondly, what many people do not realize is that in the old Soviet Union, the engineering base of the old Soviet Union, the defense industry base of the Soviet Union was Ukraine. Okay. That was the main, in fact, part of the Soviet Union, which was the heavy engineering foundation of the entire Soviet Union. So even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, whenever we would perhaps purchase various kinds of defense equipment or spares and components, it seemed as if the label was Russian, but actually all the things came from Ukraine. So the most recent example is that we have purchased 4 very modern frigates from Russia, but we can't take ownership of them because the marine engines for those frigates had to come from Ukraine. And that factory which used to supply those engines are also disrupted. So this relationship between Russia and Ukraine, also their legacy relationship, I think is not so much appreciated here in India. That very large part of the existing defense relationship also requires cooperation from Ukraine. So the war has hit us also through that route. So when we are talking about why we should be with Russia, I think we have to recognize that while there are certainly legacy elements, that we need to keep into account, but we should not make the mistake of thinking that India-Russia relations today is something like what it was with the Indo-Soviet relations. So that's an important aspect when we say, where should India, where does India's interests lie, then this aspect needs to be appreciated. The other issue is, with regard to, if our relations with Russia has been in somewhat longer term decline. What about the other side? Some people will be saying, particularly the Americans, as you see, are saying, India must choose, India must decide, which side you are on. And this is a choice that you must make today. So you saw that there was a long line of Western, foreign ministers and others who were visiting Delhi and trying to persuade India that it should take a much more open stand in criticizing Russia. There have been, if you look at much of the commentary from the Western side, whether it is European or whether it is American, there also you see headlines like India must choose, or this is the last opportunity for India to make up its mind. Those kind of commentaries come, and they obviously try to push India into taking a much more, open position of condemnation of Russia. So there are people in India also who say, actually your interests are much closer to the United States and the West, and there is really no reason why you should be inhibited in taking a much more explicit stand on this. Now, I would answer this by pointing out that whatever be the open discourse, whatever be the commentary, public commentary, my sense is that United States and most other Western countries, in fact, have a very clear understanding of what India's position is. One, they are aware of what I mentioned to you as the long-term sort of marginalization of India-Russia relations. They are aware of that India-Russia relations today are not what it was in the past, and it is declining. And therefore, there is not much sense of threat that India is together with Russia. Also, it is very clear, as I said, that while there may be such criticism of India, there is also an awareness that the compulsions which India operates under are, in fact, the very compulsions that many of the Western countries are operating under. Whether it is in terms of, buying gas, despite the war taking place, gas is still flowing through Ukraine into Western Europe. Not many people are aware of that, but actually it is one of the strange ironies that while there is a war going on, still there is gas flowing from Russia through Ukraine to Western Europe. Even sanctions have been put on Russian banks, even though Russia has been, in a sense, unplugged from the global financial system. 3 or 4 Russian banks, which are involved in that gas trade, have been exempt. Which means that payments from, say, West Germany or from various other West European countries for the gas that they are still getting from Russia, through these banks, payments can be made. So there are all these exceptions which are not always very apparent to people, but those exceptions are there. So we should be a little careful not to sort of fall into this kind of a even self-criticism that, oh, India should be really making up its mind where it belongs. Because in terms of the current relationship with Russia on the economic and commercial side, enough exceptions are there on the Western side. And certainly compared to what India's link with Russia is, India's commercial relationship is a minor fraction of what it still exists between Russia and the Western countries. So there is really no reason, especially those who are in the business of day-to-day diplomacy, there is no reason for you to feel pressured as a result of this. And I think what has been happening is that in the private conversations which India has been having with their counterparts from the US, from counterparts from from Western Europe, Japan. This aspect has been brought to in front of them, and they have backed off. So why do I say that they have backed off? Because if you see that India has then been invited, say, to another summit of the Quad countries, that India has been invited to the G7 summit by Germany, the host. There is certainly doesn't seem to be any kind of, say, reservation about the importance of India in terms of whatever is the larger picture which is emerging as a result of the Ukraine war. And this brings me to the China question, because what we see as the Western response to what India is doing is essentially because of the China challenge looming very large, both on Western calculations, but of course, it is always there, already there in Indian calculations. So what is the China factor here? So for quite some time, as you would have noted, that the relationship between Russia and between China and the United States of America, one is still the world's preeminent power. The second is the second largest power. This rivalry has been becoming more and more sharp. The change in this relationship has really started sometime from the global economic and financial crisis of 2007-2008. Which was the first time that there was a major economic and financial crisis at the very heart of the capitalist world. It was no longer a debt crisis in Latin America or a debt crisis in some, European country like Greece, for example, but this was actually a major crisis at the very heart of the global economic and financial system. Now, all countries were impacted. India was also very much impacted by that. But once the crisis was over, its after effects, of course, continued, but once the crisis itself was over, the country which came out relatively unscathed from this crisis was China. So, if the American growth rate came down and there was contraction, other countries were impacted. India's growth rate, having been 8 to 9% per annum, after the global financial economic crisis, went down to 6 or 7% per annum. Western Europe also went into almost a stagnant kind of a situation. China, on the other hand, with 1 year of some shock, went back to a 6 to 7% rate of growth, virtually a couple of years later, and was able to maintain that growth rate over a period of time. So what happened was that the gap between the two countries in terms of economic capabilities, in terms of military capabilities, and increasingly in terms of technological capabilities, that gap between China and the United States of America started shrinking. On the other hand, if you look at India, which before 2007-2008 was smaller than China, but actually was being looked upon as shrinking the gap with China. Go back to, say, 2005, 2006, for example, when I was Foreign Secretary, India was being touted as the next China. That this is a country which is going to be the next important, major power in the world. You recall that there had been the tsunami, 2004-2005. India was one of the first countries which was able to use its navy to deliver assistance to a very large number of countries in Southeast Asia, for example. This came as a bit of a revelation, say, to the United States and to other Western countries. The Quad began then. As Foreign Secretary, every morning I used to have phone calls with my counterparts from the US, from China and Australia, how we could coordinate the delivery of assistance to various countries in the region. So that is the idea of Quad began with that. So what I'm trying to put across to you is that during that period, India's diplomatic options expanded. as a result of the international perception, yes, India is behind China, but is increasingly closing the gap with China. And that, as I mentioned to you, gave us more diplomatic space, as a result of which we were actually able to negotiate the nuclear deal with the United States. If that perception had not been there, we could not have got the nuclear deal. Let me tell you, as someone who was associated with those negotiations, China has played a very important role in terms of, enabling that agreement to take place. But after 2007, 2008, the gap between India and China again started expanding. So on the one hand, you have the US-China gap reducing, and you have the India-China gap increasing. And that continues to be the case even today. Therefore, China's attitude, if you see after 2007, 2008, became far more assertive, became far more aggressive, because they felt they now had the wherewithal to make others listen to what they are saying. So it is, if you see that trajectory, the attitude of Russia to China began changing, because Russia then started seeing that its own decline could some extent be compensated by a much closer relationship with China. Secondly, both of them had a common perception of threat from the West, particularly the United States of America. So they felt that, they had a common interest in coming together and somehow trying to put a stop to the kind of pressures which were coming on them from the West. And the climax of that was, in fact, the joint statement concluded by Russia and China on February 4 this year, at the time of the Winter Olympics, when Putin went as the only head of state for the Winter Olympics to Beijing, and then they came up with a joint declaration. And if you look at that joint declaration, it is really a kind of a manifesto for a very different kind of world order than what we have today. So essentially that China, with the support of Russia, should be able to write the rules of the game henceforward. So this is, again, the importance of that joint declaration has perhaps been missed. Even in India, perhaps we have not paid as much attention to it. And the reason why I have said it is important is that whatever issues we have, whatever reservations that India has about the Western-dominated global order or global system, we also say that it should be adjusted to to reflect our viewpoint. Why do we say that we should be permanent member of the Security Council? Because we feel that our voice is not being heard as much as it should. So in those terms, we do have reservations about the existing system, but we have greater reservations of any system which may come in its place, which would be dominated by China and Russia. That too is clear. So where does the balance of our interests lie? Balance of our interests lie in adjusting the existing order, but not accepting an order which is going to be dominated by China. So that also, in terms of choices that we make, I think this aspect is very important. Lastly, I would like to just make the point that what is the objective of India's foreign policy? Or if you have a national strategy, what is the objective of that strategy? To me, that's the objective of that strategy is really the transformation of India. How do we bring about an economic, technological, and even military transformation of India? Because if we have to face the China challenge, then that challenge has to be met essentially with our own capabilities. We have been talking about if there is a war tomorrow with China, who will stand with India? People believe there are countries which may stand with India, sympathize with India, support India, but no country will come and fight together with you against China. This should be something we should be clear about. So if that is really what will enable you to meet the China challenge, longer, if you're taking a longer term perspective, there is no alternative but actually to bring about the transformation of India itself in terms of its economy, in terms of its technological prowess, in terms of its military capabilities. And that ultimately depends upon the economy. After all, China has been able to become such a powerful country precisely because for 40 years, it has been able to grow at the rate of something like, 9% to 10% per annum. Not that India, and I think all of you should perhaps be more, confident about this than I should be, that it's not that India is not capable of getting on to an accelerated growth path. But that requires difficult decisions to be taken. But if that is the goal of our foreign policy, of our national strategy, then how do we bring this about? Now, this is where we can draw lessons from geopolitical history. So what we find is that every country which wants to develop, which wants to advance, has to look at what it can borrow, assimilate, adopt from the existing centers of excellence, centers of knowledge that exist in that particular era. So if you go back to history, Romans borrowed from the Greeks, to some extent, they also borrowed from the Persians because they were a very advanced civilization. If you look at the Arabs also brought knowledge from China, from India, from Persia, then they became a very major civilization. The Renaissance in Europe afterwards took place on the basis of translations of old Greek texts which had been translated into Arabic and then they were retranslated into Latin languages. And that is how, the Renaissance started in Europe. More recent history. If you take the United States of America itself, the United States of America actually became a developed country by begging, borrowing and stealing from the West Europeans, including the British. That is how they became a major power. And then you have, say, Japan, the Meiji era and the development of Japan itself. They sent mission after mission to Western countries to try and get as much knowledge, technology as possible to build up a modern country themselves. They even adopted Western dress, if you see, top hats and frock coats, because they wanted to be completely Westernized. Because that is the way they thought that they could actually develop. And of course, the most recent example is China. What did China do? It took advantage of an advantageous geopolitical situation. In 1972, the US tried to bring China into its fold in order to confront the Soviet Union, which it regarded as the biggest threat. And of course, China also regarded it as a threat. But what China was also able to do was to utilize that denial moment to get as much technology, knowledge, access to the most, advanced universities of the West, not just the United States, but other Western countries as well. So you have a 40-year period where China had perhaps the most benign international geopolitical and economic environment. And it used that to its fullest extent to become today the second largest, economy in the world. So that is the lesson I would draw from that, that today there is a benign geopolitical moment for India. Because most of the major countries, the United States, Western Europe, Japan, even I would say Southeast Asia, have a stake in India emerging as the key countervailing power to China. They don't see any other country with the kind of heft that India has to be able to support them in that role. So this is why I'm saying that this is an advantageous moment for you. Can you leverage this moment in order to bring about that transformation of India, which ultimately is the only guarantee, only assurance of your ability to meet the China challenge, quite apart from the importance of the transformation of India itself. So I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. So nice of you. Can I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
Also, yeah. You were telling that China, India is narrowing the gap in terms of economic powers by virtue of its GDP growth against China. But
Yeah, earlier period.
But
From
of late,
2003 to 2007,
uh,
that particular period,
yeah.
India was smaller than China.
Yeah.
It was shrinking the gap between the two countries.
Yeah, but of late they have overtaken.
That's
correct.
That's
but
so,
that advantage got nullified.
So the today, like for example, I have mentioned in several of my writings that when I talk to my Chinese counterparts today, about relationship between India and China, and I complain about the arrogance of China or that you are trying to be too assertive. Sometimes their answer is, but our Indian friends should realize we are today 5 times your size. This will reflect in the nature of the relationship. Essentially saying that you should realize that you are in the junior league, we are in the senior league. That's the kind of.
And also, very recently, China made a statement. It is not the US is a very high impact to Indian economy, but I have a much more higher impact in terms of overall supplies and so on.
Yeah, true. That is true. There is no doubt that even after Galwan, the incidents which took place at the border, and where we said that we have to rethink our economic dependence upon China. But in many areas, we have not been able to.
Not an easy one.
Because many of our key exports are competitive because we have access to cheaper components and APIs, for example, for our pharmaceutical industry. That's a classic example. Or our, electronics industry. Many of the components that we use, in fact, are coming from China. Why? Because they are competitive. But having said that, there is certainly an effort on the part of the government of India, as far as I can understand, to try and see how we can reduce that dependence. This is not only a challenge for India, as you can see, this is a challenge for many countries because China is the largest trading partner for virtually all important countries. But thanks to the pandemic, thanks to the Ukraine war, because there have been very major disruptions of global supply chains, value chains, there is a general kind of a move to either reshore or, as they say, nearshore, or try to put in place more reliable, supply chains where the participants in the supply chain are friends, not necessarily adversaries. As would be apparent, this cannot be done overnight. Even if you try to bring that about, it can only happen over a period of time, as India itself is discovering.
Okay. I have one last question before, then I open it to the questions. If you look at the way the globalization is happening before the corona, and corona exposed a lot of weaknesses and kind of this thing, and a lot of dependence on one few countries and kind of this thing, the world got disrupted. And also the latest Ukraine-Russia war and the realignment of superpowers and the kind of sides, people taking sides, Russia, China, and so on. Are we going back from globalization to regionalization? Is this a new beginning and kind of this thing? Therefore, the realignment may pave way for a World War III, may not be now, maybe in the 30, 40 years from down the line.
So let me first answer the question about globalization. My sense is that since globalization is really the consequence, a creature of technology and technological advancement, as long as technological advancement continues, globalization will continue. It may change its form. There may be some adjustments here and there, but to say that globalization itself is in retreat, that I do not think is correct. So stalling is taking place in some areas. But if you take, for example, the period of the pandemic, you will see that while there may have been some nearshoring, as I said, some reshoring of facilities, if you take the digital space, that has actually been developing globalization. Look at what may have happened in the world over, say, the next 10 years or 15 years actually happened within 2 years or 3 years.
Because of corona.
Exactly. So I think we should be a little careful not to announced the demise of globalization prematurely, because I think globalization is here to stay. And as long as we are all addicted to the internet, we are all addicted to our smartphones, and we are WhatsApping all the time, I'm afraid that globalization is not going to be reversed. So, so that is one aspect that we need to take into account. And the other aspect that I wanted to mention was that your second question about is there going to be a new Cold War? Could that lead to a Third World War? Of course, wars are very difficult to predict, but I would say this. Please also see that there is a fundamental difference between the Cold War that we had been through from for post-Cold War, Second World War to the end of the Cold War, and what we have today. Because even at their height, neither the US nor the USSR nor Western Europe had any kind of significant economic or trade relations. There were virtually two separate, entities. There was very little contact. Today, on the other hand, the kind of interpenetration, the kind of, the US economy and the Chinese economy are actually joined at the hip. So how do you unravel that? There may be some decoupling taking place in the high-tech sectors. Artificial intelligence may be some very, very sophisticated technology. But still, if you look at the volume of China-US trade today, it is the world's largest. Absolutely. Yeah. So to bring a complete separation there is simply not realistic. Which leads me to think that even though there may be even an increase in tensions between the US and China, and between China and the West, there is a certain floor below which it is unlikely to go, unless, of course, people go mad and they fight with each other. That's always possible.
Dictators make it.
Yes, but that's a different matter. But if we are looking at it rationally, there is a big difference between the Cold War that we had been through and what we are facing today. This is a very important difference.
Thank you, sir. We have a few questions. Mrs. Sudhir Jalan has a question.
So first of all, let me congratulate you for a brilliant, almost masterly presentation of the geopolitical situation. I have two questions to ask, one coming out of your talk and one beyond it. You mentioned about the China-India economic gap increasing in the last few years. Has the situation not changed a bit after the pandemic? And with China plus one theory coming into Western countries, is it not destined to reduce further? The second question was beyond this. What US did as part of the sanction, they froze the account of all Russia in hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, does this not encourage others not to keep their money in the US Treasury? Leave aside countries like India, but China, with their massive amount of reserves in USA, can divest, which will put US in trouble.
Yeah. So one about the China-India economic gap, is there something different happening after the pandemic? Not yet. It may happen, but it is not happening yet. So if you take just the pandemic years, where there was a lot of talk about China plus one, also that we must have more reliable supply chains. What we found was that, the most of the supply chains are actually located in the Asian region. Markets may be the US, Western Europe, Japan, but much of the production chains are actually China plus the Southeast Asian countries. What we found during the pandemic was that actually the volume of trade taking place between China and Southeast Asia actually expanded, didn't go down. So contrary to the impression that actually because of the pandemic, China's economic profile would diminish, it did not diminish. That was the reality on the ground. Are there shifts taking place? from China? Yes, they are taking place because China itself is growing up in the value chain. So a lot of the labor-intensive industries, which were really the foundation of China's early economic rise, those have become less and less competitive as labor costs have gone up, as costs in general have gone up. So China itself, Chinese companies themselves are actually divesting from China and relocating in countries like, say, Vietnam, countries like Bangladesh, textiles. It's very major shift is taking place away from China. But India is not benefiting from it. Which are the countries benefiting? Actually, next door, Bangladesh has benefited the most. Yeah, and so has Vietnam. So even if we are talking about, say, in the future, there may be more and more China +1, that +1 is increasingly not India. Even though theoretically we should be, after all, the scale of our market, the very large, labor pool that we have, logically we should be. But because of other regulatory issues, there are issues of, bureaucratic kind of red tape. Many of those investments are not really coming to India, which is the reason why we need to change. The other aspect about the Treasury Securities and how what US is doing may actually undermine the role of the US dollar itself, right? That is the point. Well, the paradox here is that it should happen, but none of the other countries have the scale of the and density of the US financial system to actually come as a substitute. European Union tried. The European Union also is not happy about the dependence on the US dollars. So euro was being actually presented as a very safe, reliable alternative to the US dollar. They did not succeed. They did not succeed because even with Europe being such a major economy and financial hub, it was not able to match the density and the scale of the US financial market. Now, what about China? China theoretically has that scale. And in fact, that scale is increasing very rapidly. But China has a problem that China does not like volatility. So it is not ready to embrace convertibility, full convertibility. The US dollar is fully convertible. Anybody can change the dollar. You can't do that with the Chinese currency. And until the Chinese currency actually really becomes convertible, it cannot supplant the US. So yes, people have grave reservations about the dollar, and they have grave reservations about the use of sanctions and the dominance of, say, the SWIFT system, but they are not really able to do very much about it. And every time there is a crisis, even if the crisis is a US-induced crisis, everybody runs to the dollar, which is what you saw even after the economic and financial crisis. It did not affect the US dollar.
The next question, Dr. Juneja, can you come out and unmute and ask question, please? You're on mute, sir. Please unmute. Unmute and ask question. You're on mute. Okay, I think we have some difficulties. Dr. Juneja is unable to mute, I think. Can I invite Mr. Krishan Kalra? He has a question.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Shyam Saran ji, very enlightening talk. I know you ever since you were Joint Secretary Economic Relations and years now. Now you have even also read your interview yesterday with Karan Thapar, and I find your views, of course, as usual, are very bright. But my basic question is: do you think China wants to engage us as India militarily because they want us to keep our resources tied up in the other area rather than economic development, so that we are more engaged and spend more resources in military areas rather than this, maybe at the infrastructure level, at the LOC level, wherever it is. I want your answer on that. Thank you.
So it is, always very difficult to gauge what Chinese calculations may be. But my experience with China tells me is that, if they made a departure, and this was a major departure that we maintained despite the differences on the border. We maintained almost, 50 years of relative calm and tranquility on the border. And this could not have been possible unless both the countries had a stake in maintaining that peace and tranquility at the border. So why should the Chinese have made this serious departure from the past? That is the question that we have to answer. My sense is that it is not just one issue, but several issues put together. One, if we take the local issue itself, what has been happening is that while China has been improving the border infrastructure on its side for several years, and there is therefore a big asymmetry there also between Indian side and the Chinese side, over the last 10 years or so, India, in a sense, woke up and also started investing a great deal of resources in improving the infrastructure on its side of the border. And to be fair, significant improvements have been made both under the previous government as well as under the current government. So this improvement in infrastructure has also, in a sense, irritated China or made China a bit anxious, because the kind of overwhelming superiority which they maintained at the border, that has been diminished to some extent. And they have been making this point to us all at various kinds of meetings that we have had with the Chinese. They have been complaining about the fact that India is building up infrastructure on its side. To which our answer always is, well, you have been building up infrastructure on your side. Why should you complain if India is doing the same? Secondly, I think also over the last several years, what has happened is that China's confrontation with the US has sharpened, has become more, serious. Now, any kind of moves which are made between US and India, then China looks at those developments from the prism of its relationship with the US. So it always thinks that India could be coming together with the US to undermine Chinese interests. And this is also something that comes up again and again in our conversations. That, you are getting closer to the Americans, that you have given up on your non-aligned policy, you are no longer taking an independent decision. So if you take the change in perception on the part of China, they have become more anxious about the role that India is playing. And secondly, they have become more conscious of the fact that they are now strong enough to assert their interests in a manner that they were not able to do before. Because they are much stronger power. So it is a combination of all these elements together which explains what has happened. Not that we did not have confrontations at the border before, but we had very important protocols that we unfurl a banner, say you are on our territory, make your point, and then you disengage. More recently, they have said, we will not disengage. We will push you out because this is our territory. So there is a certain new assertiveness which we have not seen before.
Okay, thank you, sir.
So much indeed. I'm looking forward to reading your book now.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Kisan Kalra is here.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm sorry it had taken me a moment to unmute myself. That's why I couldn't come in earlier. Mr. Saran, first of all, my apologies. I haven't heard your speech right from the beginning. So if my question is irrelevant and you've already spoken about it, just ignore that. A view is emerging around the world, and rightly so, that the Russia-Ukraine war has now gone on for too long, and effort should be made at reconciliation, which would be looked at Russia as a sort of a victory, that the world is kind of buckled down and they're asking us to withdraw, things like that. Is that likely to encourage and embolden China to do a Ukraine on the two fronts that we share with them, Arunachal and Ladakh?
Well, I mean, let me break it up into two parts. One is if there is the likelihood of reconciliation, number one, is there a likelihood of reconciliation between Russia and Ukraine? My answer to that question would be no. Because things have gone so far that I cannot see a reconciliation. At the most, maybe a ceasefire, perhaps, maybe that could be possible. But I have made the point that no matter which way you look at it, no matter how long the war continues, Russia has, in fact, in a sense, lost this war. Why do I say that? Because even if the war goes on, say, for another few months, and Russia is able to further, destroy Ukraine's infrastructure and many more lives are lost. At the end of the day, whenever, say, Russia decides to call a halt to this war, what is the price it would have got? A completely devastated, ravaged Ukraine with a population which is probably for generations going to be very, very hostile to Russia. Is that victory in any sense? That is one aspect. Secondly, Russia has said that the main reason why it went to war with Ukraine was not so much for Ukraine itself, but because NATO was expanding closer and closer to the Russian borders. And it wanted to prevent Ukraine from also becoming part of NATO. She wanted legal guarantees. But as a result of the Ukraine war, Russia has actually managed to convert two neutral countries, Finland and Sweden, who now will become part of NATO and much closer to the borders of Russia. So is that victory in any sense? So this is why I have maintained that this has been a miscalculation on the part of of Russia. And the best that Russia can hope for is to be able to extricate itself from this situation by declaring some form of victory. For example, they can say at least the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine is now under control, or that we have managed to secure Crimea by also, occupying some part of the Ukraine coast. But that is not victory in the sense that they had originally put forward. That this was not to do with Ukraine itself, but it had to do with NATO and the United States. So in that sense, I cannot see how Russia can really declare victory in any sense. So this brings you to the China part. Now, China, like many other countries, including Western countries, thought that with the overwhelming force that Russia has been able to deploy, it will be just a question of days before Ukraine falls, and they will be able to put a pro-Russian government in place. That did not happen. I mean, these are imponderable, these are uncertainties in any war. So they did not think that the war will have to go on for so long that there will be this kind of resistance from Ukraine. China also did not believe that. China also thought that maybe another few days' time, this would be wrapped up. Now they realize that in really announcing a very strong strategic partnership with Russia, they have also, in a sense, become a target of international reproval. That is because across the world, everybody is saying whatever may be the reasons why Russia did this, you cannot go and invade an independent sovereign country. So to that extent, Russia and China standing together is creating a kind of a negative image for China also. Secondly, what has happened with sanctions against Russia is also making China very cautious. Because should it tomorrow be subject to anything like what has been imposed on Russia, it will have a major impact on the Chinese economy, which is far more globalized, far more interconnected with the global economy than Russia has been. So, to the extent that, I can only sense this, to the extent that China is somewhat more on the defensive today as a result of the Ukraine war, I would imagine that it will be a little more cautious in its dealings with India than it has been in the past. That's.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I think there are a lot of questions, but due to paucity of time, I think we have to close.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Brilliant, sir. Brilliant session. I think give a big round of applause. So, because I myself have so many questions, but I think you have taken so much efforts to come all the way.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Special thanks to you, sir.
It's a pleasure. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, during
No,
lunchtime.
lunchtime.
During lunchtime. So, due to this thing, for fond of affection and this thing, a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, the session is formally closed. Thanks all. I think a lot of people online and all. I think we'll adjourn for lunch. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for all.